I sat perfectly still beneath the chandeliers, my fingers tightening around the wine glass as his voice carried across the ballroom. She donates pennies. Don't expect much. My son's laughter mingled with the crowd's, sharp as glass, polished as cruelty. The foundation I had once built, the name I had once guarded, reduced to a punchline in sequins and champagne. Pennies. After decades of sacrifice, after carrying his father's legacy alone, I was nothing but a joke. Until the screen lit up with a name he hadn't rehearsed. Mine. Wait. Before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. The ballroom shimmered in hotel chandeliers, all glass and gold like a memory someone was trying too hard to hold on to. Tuxedos and designer gowns glided across the floor, martinis tilted in loose hands, the chatter sharp with money and vague promises. A string quartet played something forgettable by the fountain. But it wasn't the music that made the crowd buzz. It was the promise of seeing Brian Mercer on stage again, the reformed son, the headline grabber, the comeback story. Brian stood near the velvet-curtained wings, clutching a sweating glass of water, knuckles white. His reflection shimmered in a wall mirror beside him, crisp black tux, slicked back hair, and a smile that wouldn't hold still. His handler gave him a thumbs up. The hotel manager muttered something about timing the donation screen. Brian barely heard either. The MC's voice echoed across the grand room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Brian Mercer." Polite applause rose like steam, practiced and shallow. Brian stepped into the spotlight. He could feel it, that weight in the air. Not pressure, expectation, judgment, memories. He walked slowly to the podium, clearing his throat just once before leaning into the mic. "Good evening," he began, voice smooth. "I want to thank you all for coming to support what my late father believed in. Clean water, clean neighborhoods, and, as always, a clean conscience." Laughter scattered through the tables like dice on marble. He waited just half a beat, then delivered it. "My mother used to say, 'Brian, if we ever go broke, it'll be because your father gave it all away in pennies.'" He smiled. "So don't expect too much tonight. It's genetic." This time, the laughter rolled stronger, the kind that said, "He's still got it." Even the waitstaff cracked polite grins. The charity board at table 6 clinked their glasses. But near the back, by the second-tier donors, Janet Mercer didn't laugh. She sat upright, hands folded on her lap like she'd been sculpted that way. Her face didn't move, not even a blink. Only her eyes followed him, those same blue-gray eyes that had once thrown him out of the house without a coat. Brian saw her. Of course he saw her. And just for a second, his throat tightened. His timing slipped. But he didn't stammer. He never stammered. He let the silence stretch for half a second longer than it should have, then added, "But seriously, thank you all for showing up tonight. My father would have been proud of most of you." Laughter again, nervous this time with a splash of surprise. At the VIP table front and center, Melanie Crane leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs slowly, deliberately. Her red satin gown caught the light like a flame. She didn't laugh. She smirked. The kind of smirk that meant, "I know something you don't." Brian's eyes flicked to her. That smirk hit him harder than the lights. She looked so at home there, like she'd been sitting at the head table all her life, like she belonged in that seat. And that only meant one thing. Someone let her back in. Brian kept talking, voice calm, but inside, the script had fallen to pieces. His mouth moved, charming the room on autopilot, while his mind ran cold. Melanie Crane. Here. Wearing that. Sitting there. She hadn't even RSVP'd. He finished the opening remarks with something forgettable about community, gave a practiced half bow, and stepped off the stage into a sea of clapping hands and champagne smiles. As he moved toward the side hallway, his handler rushed up. "You crushed it. Seriously, that Pennies joke? Genius." Brian didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Melanie now, watching her lean into the mayor's ear with a whisper, then laugh softly, as if the world were hers again. He didn't see Janet stand, but he heard the chair scrape. He turned too late to catch the full moment but saw enough. Janet Mercer, walking toward the exit, not looking back, not waiting for applause, just leaving. She hadn't clapped once. As Brian turned back toward the crowd, the mic, still live, crackled behind him, and someone else's voice came through, a woman's, low, sharp. "Not everyone in this room deserves to be forgiven." Brian froze mid-step. The room did too. And then, everything changed. The car door shut with a soft thunk behind her, muffling the applause that still echoed from the hotel ballroom. Janet Mercer stood for a moment in the valet circle, back straight, chin high, the night breeze stirring the silk scarf at her throat. Her driver opened the back door, but she shook her head. "I'll drive myself," she said. Her voice wasn't sharp, just final. By the time she pulled into the curved driveway of her colonial brick home, her hands had stopped shaking. The house was dark except for one amber lamp glowing in the upstairs window. Left on by habit, not for anyone waiting. Inside, she paused only long enough to kick off her heels by the stairs before moving with practiced quiet to the hall closet. A single key rested in a porcelain dish behind the umbrella stand. She hadn't used it in over a decade. In the guest room closet, far from her own, far from Victor's, the fireproof box lay beneath a stack of old linens, behind a barely used Pilates mat and a forgotten pair of skis. She knelt slowly, her knees stiff, her breath even. The lock clicked open on the second try. She pulled the lid back. There they were, neatly stacked folders, untouched by time or dust, each labeled with her late husband's tight block lettering. "Trust," one read. "Long-term, Q3. Mercer Family Fund, private." And then, her favorite, Janet. "In case." She opened that one first. Inside, investment summaries, decades worth. Victor's small notes in the margins, always in pencil. His cautious optimism, his clean arithmetic. The ink never bragged, but the numbers did. Her trust, separate from the family fund, quietly maintained in her name, had grown. Dramatically. She stared at the final page. The current balance looked like a misprint. But it wasn't. Janet closed the folder, exhaling slow. She wasn't angry anymore. She was ready. The landline phone still sat on the desk in the front study. An old habit, never replaced. She lifted the receiver and dialed from memory. 3 rings. Then, Janet. His voice still had that familiar hush, like everything he said was a secret worth keeping. "Victor," she said, settling into the desk chair like someone taking her rightful seat. "Is it time?" There was no need to explain. Not after what she'd just seen. Not after years of watching from the sidelines. Quietly, while Brian spun redemption from polished lies. Victor paused. A soft exhale, almost a chuckle. "If you say so." "I saw her tonight," Janet said. "Melanie. Sitting at my husband's table like she never tore us apart." "She was invited," Victor replied. "The committee thought it would humanize him." "Of course," she said. "He's very good at humanizing himself, especially when someone else pays the price." Victor didn't argue. Janet stood, walked to the window, looked out across the garden she used to trim herself. The dogwood had overgrown again. Brian always said he'd send someone. She pressed the receiver tighter. "We could outdonate the room," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Victor's tone shifted. More awake now. "You'd be announcing your return." No, she said. I'd be reminding them I never left. There was silence on the line, but it wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. Strategy. Victor was already imagining the headlines, the whispers. Janet Mercer matches every dollar raised. The estranged matriarch returns with a statement. Whose legacy does the Mercer fortune belong to now? Finally, he said, You want it to be clean, or do you want it to hurt? Janet smiled, slow and unhurried. I want it to be true. Victor chuckled again, but it wasn't humor. It was recognition. Then let's begin. She hung up without saying goodbye. Upstairs, she returned the documents to the fireproof box, locking it carefully before replacing it exactly where it had lived all these years. Still in her name. Still untouched. She walked back down the hall and into the kitchen, flicking on the light with a decisive snap. The space was spotless, cold, like a museum of someone else's life. She didn't open the fridge. She didn't pour a drink. She sat at the long island, opened her laptop, and signed into the trust's portal. Transfer funds, the tab read. Janet hovered over the keyboard, then she began to type. A ping echoed from her inbox. One new email. Subject line, anonymous submission. R.E. Brian Mercer, Melanie Crane, affair timeline. Janet's eyes narrowed. She clicked. The next morning, Janet's Audi pulled into a gated condo complex in Alexandria. It was barely past 8 a.m., and the neighborhood still held that quiet Sunday morning hush, gardens dewed, flags still, coffee brewing behind high-end glass. Janet stepped out in navy slacks and a crisp white blouse, no jewelry except for her wedding band. She carried no purse, just a single accordion folder tucked beneath her arm. She pressed the buzzer labeled Colleen Sharp. No title, no fancy calligraphy, just ink on tape. The door opened within seconds. Colleen was still in leggings and a Loyola sweatshirt, her hair half dried and up in a clip. You're early, she said, stepping aside. I'm ready, Janet replied, walking past her with the weight of someone who'd never once been turned away from a room that mattered. The condo was small but modern. Clean counters, stacked books, a calendar pinned with event dates and donor calls. Colleen waved a hand at the kitchen table already set up with iced coffee, highlighters, and 2 laptops. I pulled what you asked for, Colleen said, sitting down. Sponsor lists from the last 5 galas, breakdowns by tier, matching funds, social reach. You were right. Melanie didn't just show up. Someone got her on the VIP slate. Janet didn't blink. She opened her folder, laid out a sheaf of printouts, and tapped a name halfway down one of the lists. Shore Stream Realty, new sponsor, big jump. Colleen nodded. Late-stage buy-in, 2 weeks ago, wired $500,000 overnight. Which got her a seat at the head table, Janet said flatly. Which got them into Brian's pocket, Colleen replied. Janet leaned back, silent. The morning light hit the side of her face, catching the soft hollows time had carved beneath her cheekbones. Her eyes didn't blink much. They just held on to thoughts. I want the full contract for the Shore Stream sponsorship, she said. I can request it, Colleen replied. But it'll come through Brian's office first. I'll get it another way, Janet said. What about unclaimed slots? Colleen shifted, clicked open a spreadsheet. One left. Legacy tier. Buy-in minimum 7 figures. But it comes with speaker access, guest table curation, and branding rights at the luncheon. Is it restricted? Technically, no. But politically? It's not meant for someone like you. Janet smiled without warmth. I'm not here to be liked. Colleen hesitated. You'll be seen as retaliatory. I am retaliatory, Janet said simply. This isn't about optics, it's about memory. She lifted her iced coffee but didn't sip. Let them whisper, she said. Let them guess what I'm funding next. Colleen was quiet for a moment. Then she turned the screen. If we move today, you'll beat the Gala printing deadline. Your name will be in the donor brochure. Not my name, Janet said, standing. The trust. Let them ask whose. She crossed to the window, looking out across the row of brick units, sun washing over identical hedges and empty patios. Calm, suburban. Deceptively still. Janet turned back. Get me the paperwork. I'll sign today. Colleen hesitated again. Are you sure? No, Janet said, but I'm sure enough. They spent the next 30 minutes reviewing disclosures, benefit tiers, and internal policy strings that, if tugged correctly, unraveled more than Brian had ever imagined. Janet was deliberate, focused, never glancing at her phone. But as she packed up to leave, Colleen's screen lit up again. Wait, Colleen said, frowning. You need to see this. She turned the screen again. Instagram, Melanie Crane, fresh post from the gala. Front-facing camera, perfect lighting, glass in hand. Her caption read, "Grateful to our VIP sponsor family for making this night unforgettable. Car Mercer Gala. Planart Power Tables. Gosh, clean water strong." The photo carousel flipped. Melanie with the ShoreStream CEO, Melanie with the mayor, Melanie with Brian. And finally, Melanie alone at the podium, a mic in one hand. Brian's jacket slung casually over her shoulders. Janet stared at the screen for a long time. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. Then, almost too quiet to hear, Janet murmured, "He let her wear the family name." And Colleen said, "No, Janet. He gave it away." Janet closed the folder. War had been declared. The morning light in Victor's office was filtered through slatted blinds, striping his desk in alternating bars of gold and shadow. The donation system's portal glowed on his screen, the confirmation window pulsing quietly like a secret too big for a paper trail. He leaned back in his leather chair, let out a breath, and muttered, "She actually did it. 7 figures, anonymous, clean, no flair, no vanity, just impact." He typed a short note, secure channel only, then reached for his landline. He didn't trust texts for this. The line connected after one ring. "You have a receipt number," Janet's voice said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Victor replied. "You're officially our top private donor." "Good," she said. "No press, no plaques, and absolutely no naming rights." Victor nodded slowly. "Not even a nod in the closing remarks?" Silence. Then, "He won't know until the lights come up. That's the point." Victor let that sit before replying. "Rosa's going to call you. She thinks it came from your trust. It technically did." "Let her," Janet said. "She's smart. She'll understand." And with that, she hung up. 2 floors down, in the event coordination suite of the Watergate Grand, Rosa Delgado stared at the incoming transaction notification. She blinked once, then checked the details again. Then she smiled. She grabbed her phone, stepped out into the hallway, and walked quickly toward the private lounge, away from the buzz of interns and floral deliveries. When Janet picked up, Rosa didn't waste time. "Thank you," she said. No need to confirm who was on the other end. "You saved the closing keynote." "I wasn't trying to save anything," Janet replied. "I was making sure it ended right." Rosa's smile faded slightly. "You don't want the credit?" "I want the results," Janet said. "Make sure the water grants are front and center. Nothing performative. Keep Brian out of the impact video." "I can make that happen," Rosa said. "Then we have nothing more to discuss." But Rosa didn't hang up. Instead, she added quietly, "I never believed the official version. About the estate, or the Gala board vote. I was there." There was a pause. Not cold, just considered. "I know," Janet said finally. Click. Down in the rehearsal hall, the atmosphere was entirely different. Brian Mercer stood at center stage, sleeves rolled, bow tie loose, grinning at the lighting director like he owned the moment. The giant screens were cycling his pre-approved talking points. Sponsors flashed along the bottom in glossy banners, and his name was perfectly centered across the digital podium graphic, Brian Mercer, Chairman's address. He ran through the speech one last time, confident, charming, full of pauses that assumed applause. His voice bounced back clean from the high ceilings, rehearsed enough to sound unrehearsed. The assistant stage manager gave him a thumbs up. Nailed it. One take. Wouldn't be me if it took two, Brian quipped, rolling his shoulders. He stepped down, smooth, swaggering. From the shadows near the AV booth, Melanie emerged with a water bottle and a satisfied half-smile. Sounded presidential. I'll settle for beloved, he said. She stepped in close, reaching for his bow tie. It was one of their rituals now, part affection, part theater. She tugged it into place, smoothed the corners, then pressed her palm flat against his chest. You're back, Bree, she said, eyes gleaming. They're finally seeing you for what you are. He kissed her cheek. Better late than never. Neither of them noticed the screen behind them flash with the phrase, Anonymous Legacy Donor Secures Full Water Initiative Grant. Nor did they read the small text below. Provided via the Janet T. Mercer Revocable Trust. They didn't see it. But someone else did. In the control booth, Rosa leaned over the tech lead's shoulder and said quietly, Freeze that frame. On the final slide, I want it visible until the lights go up. He glanced at her. Even with the name? Especially with the name, she said. Backstage, Brian flipped through his printed speech one last time, smiling at the ending line he thought would bring the house down. He never noticed the insert. A single sheet, slipped into the middle. A change he hadn't authorized. But the printer had, and the lights were already dimming. He was walking into it blind, just like she planned. The ballroom doors opened with a practiced hush, letting in a tide of tuxedos, sequins, and champagne laughter. Crystal chandeliers burned bright overhead, and string musicians played a lush, modern arrangement of a Springsteen classic. Rich, elegant, just edgy enough to feel curated. At the head table, Brian Mercer adjusted his cufflinks like they might catch the spotlight better if he believed hard enough. Beside him, Melanie lifted her glass toward a photographer angling for a clean shot. Click. Flash. Another one for her feed. The projection screens pulsed with the Mercer Gala insignia. Waitstaff moved like shadows between tables. Every fifth guest was someone who'd once written a think piece about legacy, and every third guest wished they had. From the podium, the MC's voice rose like velvet on cue. And now, for opening remarks, our host and chair, Mr. Brian Mercer. Applause, warm, if a little rehearsed. Brian rose to his full height, smile polished, the borrowed confidence of someone who believed his name still outshined his history. He tapped the mic once, no feedback, just silence ready to be filled. Good evening, friends. He paused. Let it breathe. I see so many familiar faces tonight, some of whom are still willing to return my calls. So I must be doing something right. Laughter. Polite. He continued. We gather here not just for water or housing or policy reform. We gather because we believe in second chances, in rebuilding what's been fractured, in giving, even when it's not convenient. Applause again. Warmer. Janet Mercer sat at table 9, not front and center, but not far off. Close enough to be seen, distant enough to remain untouchable. Her wine glass was half full. Her posture was perfect. She said nothing. A strand of silver hair curled at her jaw, catching the candlelight as she tilted her glass once, eyes forward, face unreadable. Across the room, Colleen Sharp leaned against the back wall, behind the last tier of sponsor tables. Her hands folded, her expression a mask of measured interest. She clapped, slowly. Not disrespectful. Not mocking. Just patient. On stage, Brian turned to the teleprompter with a smile that felt more genuine than it should have. "I'd like to thank our incredible board for their trust," he said. "The donors who believed even when it was easier not to. And of course, our new legacy partners, especially those who've stepped up in the last 48 hours with astonishing generosity." Melanie glanced sideways at him, then toward the screen. She reached under the table and squeezed his knee. Click. Another photographer caught it. Brian nodded to the tech team. The screens brightened. Donor spotlight, legacy tier contributors. Logo after logo faded in. Big names. Old money, the kind of brands that wore their philanthropy like armor. A soft murmur ran through the room. Brian's grin widened. He was already preparing to pivot into his speech's second act when a new slide appeared. White background, black serif type. "A special legacy gift has been made in honor of Victor L. Mercer, anonymous, via the Janet T. Mercer Revocable Trust." It hit like a ripple across still water. Whispers. Camera flashes. A chair leg scraped tile. Someone at table 4 leaned forward to reread the line. Brian blinked. Just once. The corner of his mouth twitched, but he held formation. Behind her wine glass, Janet exhaled through her nose. Not a laugh. Not quite. Melanie leaned forward, whispering something sharp. Brian's jaw tightened. He waved the MC back on stage like a man swatting away a fly in church. Colleen didn't move, but her smile curved just slightly. Brian cleared his throat, microphone still live. "Well," he said, almost too lightly, "I guess we all believe in legacy after all." It landed flat. Someone clapped once. No one followed. The screen faded to black. Rosa, at the AV booth, didn't look away. She knew what came next. Back at her table, Janet set her glass down. Her phone buzzed. A message from Victor. "The insert goes live in 10. She didn't reply. She didn't have to. Because Brian was about to read something he hadn't rehearsed. And this time, everyone would be listening. The ballroom had warmed. Wine was flowing now. Generous pours, less polite sipping. Conversations overlapped like jazz, and camera shutters flicked like moth wings near the chandeliers. At the head table, Brian Mercer dabbed at the corner of his mouth with a cloth napkin, then folded it into a crisp triangle. A stagehand tapped his shoulder and whispered something. Brian nodded, stood, adjusted his tuxedo jacket, and made his way back to the podium. The guests quieted. Spotlights narrowed. "Good evening again," Brian said, voice smooth as ever. "I hope the risotto didn't disappoint. If it did, you can blame my mother. She once told our chef that seasoning was a waste of budget." Laughter broke out across the room. Familiar. Cozy. The kind of laughter that said he's back. At table 9, Janet Mercer lifted her wine glass and took a slow sip. No smile, no flinch. Only her eyes moved, tracking him like a memory waiting to be verified. Brian kept going. "When we started rebuilding this foundation 3 years ago, there were days I wasn't sure if anyone would show up again. But tonight, you did. In record numbers. And you gave. In record numbers." He gestured toward the side screen, which lit up to display the donation tally, $3,105,000 and rising. Applause rose. Enthusiastic. Brian smiled wider. "I want to thank our sponsors, our board, and our loyal supporters, some of whom have been with us since long before I deserved that loyalty." A pause, a meaningful glance into the front rows. Melanie, already posed for her close-up, smiled like she'd rehearsed it. Flash. Another camera caught her. She shifted her wine glass just so. The diamond bracelet did the rest. Brian continued. My late father taught me that charity isn't about money. It's about memory, the kind that stays long after the check's clear. He nodded solemnly, giving the room a moment to catch its collective breath. And my mother, he added, voice taking a wry turn. Janet Mercer. Some of you know her. Some of you fear her. Same thing. More laughter, warmer this time. She once told me, and I quote, "If you want to give $1, earn 2 first." She said it at my first board meeting, in front of the CFO. The room chuckled again. A few glances drifted back to table 9. Janet didn't react. Her fingers rested lightly on the base of her wineglass, unmoving. The slight lift of one brow was the only acknowledgement. Not resistance, not approval, just accuracy. Brian moved to his next slide. The screen showed the logos of new donors, platinum tier, legacy level. A scrolling list of names passed below, all but one. He didn't mention it, didn't acknowledge it, as if that absence had never mattered. And yet, no one missed it. Not when the screen subtly pulsed with the line, fully funded by anonymous contribution, Janet T. Mercer Revocable Trust. It was quiet, centered, stark in its simplicity. Brian never looked back. He pivoted smoothly. This campaign is about expansion, new wells, urban purification systems, policy teams in Michigan, Arizona, and Georgia. We're no longer just reacting, we're building. He stood a little taller, smiled a little wider. The applause returned. But Rosa, in the AV booth, never clapped. She stayed still, headset snug, watching the room like it was a theater, and the man on stage was reading from someone else's script. Near the back, Colleen remained leaned against the wall, hands folded, face neutral. Until Brian launched into his next line. And it's thanks to people who give not for attention, but because they believe in quiet power. That's when Colleen raised her eyebrows. Just enough to mean, you finally understand. But too late. At the head table, Melanie clinked glasses with the ShoreStream CEO. Her eyes scanned the room for cameras, for angles, for evidence that the moment belonged to her too. Janet didn't drink again. She set her glass down and rested her hands in her lap. Her expression didn't change, but the room around her did. Suddenly, every whisper was about what wasn't said. Every glance forward came with a glance back. Everyone was noticing how the richest donor in the room hadn't been thanked, and how she didn't need to be. Dessert had been cleared, and the Gala ballroom hummed with the relaxed confidence of money well spent. Waiters began pouring cognac and coffee. Linen napkins were draped over chairbacks. The photo booth line had thinned. And at the center of it all, Brian Mercer held court. 3 different cameras hovered. One belonged to a political columnist from the District Ledger. Another to a lifestyle videographer who'd promised him a 90-second recap reel by morning. The third, Brian's own PR team, captured everything from just the right angle, just off the cuff. Brian stood relaxed, jacket open, posture casual but intentional. It's all about aligning legacy with impact, he said smoothly, answering a question about the anonymous 7-figure donation. Sometimes the best gifts come from the people who ask for nothing back. No credit, no claim, just quiet vision. The reporter raised an eyebrow. So, you have no idea who the donor was? Brian laughed, a little too quickly. Let's just say I've got my theories. The group chuckled. He leaned in, lowering his voice as if revealing a secret. We've had some interest from the Valley, one angel investor in particular, very under the radar. Doesn't need the spotlight. Tech money? The Ledger reporter asked. Brian winked. Smart money. At that moment, Melanie stepped in, arm slipping effortlessly through his. She offered the camera her best cheekbone, and the flash obliged. Brian's always been modest, she said. But the truth is, none of this would have happened without him. The outreach, the credibility, the vision. People give because he gives first. She kissed his cheek, and another camera flash caught it. Across the room, Colleen Sharp stood beside the back bar with a short glass of sparkling water. She didn't drink during events. Too easy to lose precision. She watched the scene unfold like a scientist tracking an experiment. Janet Mercer stepped up beside her. No words, just presence. Colleen offered her a second drink without turning. Janet took it. Is he seriously claiming he brought in the donor? He's implying it, Colleen said. He's just not using your name. That would require spine. Janet's tone was soft, almost bemused. Her eyes, however, were locked onto her son, his ease, his charm, his audacity. She took a slow sip. Silicon Valley? Colleen nodded. Angel investor. Janet exhaled through her nose. Of course. They watched in silence as Brian pivoted to his next topic. Scaling nationally, international potential, clean water as a bipartisan cause. A junior reporter from a local philanthropy blog asked, "So what made the anonymous donor give that much, with no name attached?" Brian didn't miss a beat. I think it's simple. They believe in the work, in transformation. And maybe they saw someone take ownership of his past instead of running from it. He let the line hang, then. Sometimes all it takes is one person with resources and forgiveness. Melanie squeezed his arm like it was rehearsed. That's what makes him different. From the corner of the room, Victor watched without expression. He stood half-shadowed by a curtain near the AV station, phone in hand, glasses low on his nose. A message popped up on his screen, a confirmation from the IRS portal. Submission received. Form 8283. Janet T. Mercer. Revocable trust contribution, $1,000, date filed, 9/20, 11:36 p.m. EST filing ID, DARA1MEAD723A. Attached was the final PDF. Official. Timestamped. Digitally signed. He didn't text Brian. He didn't need to. He simply forwarded the confirmation to two people, Colleen Sharp and Janet Mercer. Then he slid the phone into his inside jacket pocket and rejoined the flow of the room. Brian was still answering questions when the reporter from the District Ledger leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "Did he just admit he doesn't know where the money came from?" Her colleague shrugged. "Doesn't matter. He'll still get the cover shot." Near the back wall, Janet set her empty glass on a side table and adjusted the clasp of her bracelet. She hadn't spoken to the press. She hadn't shaken a single hand, and she hadn't stepped within 10 feet of the podium all night, and yet the headline was already written. Not by Brian, and not for him. The last call for the silent auction was met with a scattered clinking of forks and a few polite bids made out of guilt or obligation. The crowd had softened into post-dessert haze, drunk on praise and prestige. Behind the auction table, volunteers gathered clipboards and closed laptops. In the side wing near the AV booth, Janet Mercer stood next to Rosa Delgado, out of view from most of the room. She removed a folded piece of cream stationery from her clutch, small, smooth, handwritten in black ink. She handed it to Rosa without ceremony. "She'll want you to read it," Janet said. Rosa looked down at the envelope, then up at Janet. "You're sure?" Janet didn't answer. She just nodded once. Final, like a judge calling recess. The room was settling back into a hush as the MC stepped forward to announce final bids. One of the younger sponsors had just won a luxury safari package, and a round of applause went up as he awkwardly high-fived his fiancée. That's when Rosa stepped up to the second mic. No music, no spotlight, just clarity. She adjusted the height slightly, tapped it once to cut the murmurs, and began. "Before we close the evening," she said, her voice steady, The foundation would like to acknowledge a final note submitted by the contributor who made the largest donation of the night. That got their attention. Across the ballroom, heads turned, eyes refocused. Rosa unfolded the note, smoothing the paper flat against the podium. Her tone didn't change. "The anonymous donor," she read, "has asked that no naming rights, public gratitude, or media credit be extended. Their gift was not given for attention, nor applause, but for impact, and in honor of someone who lived that principle every day." She paused just long enough. "The donor is officially declining recognition." A long silence followed. Not awkward, not shocked, just unfamiliar. Like the room had entered a frequency it hadn't tuned to in years. From the center table, Brian froze. For a full second, he didn't breathe. He had just finished a side conversation with a podcast host, holding a flute of Prosecco midair. The words in his throat dissolved. Melanie leaned over slightly, confused. "Is this a setup?" she whispered. Brian didn't answer. The applause began slowly, unsure at first. A few polite claps, then more, and then, suddenly, it grew. Not thunderous, not riotous, but steady. Real. Not for a brand, not for a name, for the principle behind it, for the power of someone who didn't need a microphone. At the back of the room, Colleen gave Rosa a small nod. "Well done." In the center of it all, Brian was still blinking, still not clapping. Because it wasn't for him. It was never going to be for him. His eyes scanned the crowd, trying to find a thread, an explanation, somebody to look confused with him. But everyone had turned their focus to the podium. Or worse, toward the side of the room, where Janet Mercer now stood with her hands clasped lightly at her waist. She didn't wave, she didn't bow, she didn't move an inch. Just the faintest tilt of her head. Not smug, not cruel, just precise. Victor, seated 2 tables away, leaned back in his chair and crossed one leg over the other. He didn't clap either. But the corners of his mouth curled slightly as he watched Brian squirm in his own silence. Melanie leaned closer again. "You still want to take interviews after this?" Brian didn't respond. Rosa stepped down from the mic. The applause faded. The playlist resumed softly. A clean instrumental cover of a U2 classic floating over the chatter. Wait staff re-entered the space with espresso trays. Everything returned to normal. At least, it tried. But from that moment forward, everyone in the room knew something had shifted. The biggest moment of the night hadn't come from the stage. It had come from the space just off to the side of it. And from the hand that wrote the note no one saw her write. And from the power of a voice that didn't need to speak to be heard. The applause had long faded. The final espresso trays were emptying. Guests lingered out of habit, nursing drinks and exchanging business cards they'd forget by morning. Brian didn't linger. He moved with purpose through the side corridor, past the catering carts and bundled linens, straight into the narrow backstage hallway lined with curtain cables and light monitors. Rosa Delgado was at the far end, her headset half off, reviewing breakdown notes with a junior staffer. She looked up just in time to see him coming. "Can we talk?" Brian said. Too flat to be a question. Rosa nodded once and motioned to the side. They stepped into a dark service alcove just out of view of the main floor. The buzz of chatter from the ballroom was muffled by layers of concrete and stage rigging. Brian didn't bother with charm. "That note you read," he said. "I need the name." Rosa folded her arms across her clipboard. "It was anonymous." "I get that," he snapped, "but not to you." She didn't flinch. "I was asked to read it, not investigate it." Brian took a step closer. Not aggressive, not threatening, just pressurized. "This entire night was built on trust," he said, "on transparency. If someone's moving 7 figures through my family's event under my name, It wasn't under your name, Rosa cut in. Calm, clean, not unkind. He blinked. It came through a separate trust, she continued, legally and logistically, and it was marked confidential, but personal. That was the language. Brian exhaled through his nose. So you know. She didn't answer, which was answer enough. He turned and paced once, dragging his hand down his face like he could scrub off the confusion. She's trying to humiliate me, he said. No, Rosa replied. She's just not interested in performing for you. That landed harder than it should have. Brian leaned against the wall, suddenly aware of how hot the space had gotten. Or maybe it was just him. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was humiliating. He looked up again. Did Colleen know? Rosa shrugged lightly. She knows what she needs to. That's her gift. Brian barked a laugh. It had no humor in it. This is some kind of coordinated correction, Rosa finished for him. You said tonight was about legacy. This is what legacy looks like? There was nothing else to say. Rosa turned, walked back into the hallway, and left him in the shadow he couldn't name. Back in the ballroom, the energy had settled into a soft drone. Glasses clinked, shoes clicked against tile. A few attendees filtered toward the exits, already halfway into the next news cycle. At the far end of the room, Colleen Sharp raised her champagne glass across a small circle of board members, nodding toward Janet Mercer, who stood at the edge of it all. Janet caught the gesture, tilted her head slightly, and raised her own glass in return. Unrushed, unbothered. Victor watched from his seat, a quiet satisfaction behind his eyes, as if he'd seen the final chess move play out exactly as rehearsed. Melanie, now seated alone at the head table, scrolled through her phone with forced serenity. Her lips were pursed. Her posts were underperforming. Brian re-entered the ballroom from the side entrance. Slower now. He scanned the room like a man walking into a party he used to host, but no longer belonged to. People still nodded politely. The cameras were still around. But the center of gravity had shifted. No more questions. No more praise. Just the lingering recognition that the story had already been told, and he hadn't told it. He found his seat again. Sat down. A waiter passed by with a refill tray. Brian waved it off. He glanced around, saw Janet in conversation near the floral wall, saying very little but somehow directing the entire orbit of the guests around her. She looked like someone who'd never left, only waited. And now she was being thanked for everything without ever being asked. By morning, the hashtags had taken over. Anonymous Angel, Autre Quiet Power, Legacy Without Credit. Dozens of reposted clips from the gala circulated online. Rosa's voice at the mic. The understated applause. A still shot of Janet Mercer standing at the edge of the room, wineglass in hand, composed and untouched by flash. No interviews, no press quotes, no branding, just presence. Brian's photo, once the expected centerpiece, was buried beneath praise for the unnamed donor, praised not for money, but for silence. His earlier interviews, where he hinted at a tech investor, were clipped and dissected. One journalist tweeted, Brian Mercer, possibly the first man to get upstaged by a ghost. Comments followed fast. So the biggest donor declines credit and Brian still finds a way to make it about himself? Classic Mercer spin. Can't even shut up in someone else's silence. Funny how the real power moved without ever touching the mic. Melanie had tried to post a carousel recap that morning. Red carpet shots, table settings, Brian laughing with city council members. The algorithm buried it. Engagement was flat. She deleted it within the hour. Meanwhile, in a quiet branch office overlooking DuPont Circle, Janet sat at her banker's desk, reviewing a slim folder of documents. The banker, a woman in her 50s with excellent posture and a voice like stone polished for radio, smiled faintly as she handed over the final page. "Everything transferred cleanly," she said. "The liquidity is in place. The balance split as instructed. You'll see the updated statement by end of day." Janet flipped to the last page, signed where indicated, and closed the folder. She didn't ask for details. She already knew them. Her phone buzzed. "Colleen." Janet answered with a quiet, "Yes?" "All updated," Colleen said. "Victor's portion of the estate rolls into the community trust as planned. Shorestream Realty's board seat was dissolved without protest. Your name's off every auxiliary filing." "And the foundation's secondary trust?" "Restructured as of noon," Colleen said. "No Mercer signature required. Clean break. It now sits under the Quiet Futures Fund umbrella in your name alone." Janet's fingers tapped lightly against the closed folder. "How did Brian take it?" "I don't think he's fully processed it yet," Colleen said. "But when he does, he'll realize every spotlight he's been chasing was rented." Janet gave a small, satisfied hum. At that very moment across town, Brian stood in his office, pacing in front of a wall-mounted screen filled with open tabs, press clippings, Twitter threads, donor graphs. His name wasn't absent, it just wasn't leading. He called in his assistant. "Schedule a live Q&A this Friday. I want donor questions. Live stream. We'll title it Legacy in Action." She hesitated. "Should I—" "Just book it," he snapped, "and start a donor re-engagement campaign. Target the West Coast. Push the innovation angle." As she left, he turned back toward the screen. The one headline that refused to scroll away: "Anonymous generosity at Mercer Gala hints at deeper rift in family legacy." No byline, no source quote. Just speculation. Accurate, quiet, dangerous. Brian's jaw tightened. He moved to the liquor cart, poured something brown and familiar into a crystal glass, and sat down. He was still trying to script a future in a story someone else had already ended. Across the city, Janet stepped out of the bank and into the soft autumn breeze. The sky was low and silver, the kind of light that made everything feel sharper, cleaner. She slipped her sunglasses on, pulled her gloves from her coat pocket, and crossed the street just as Victor's car pulled up beside the curb. He stepped out, holding the door for her. "All done?" Janet nodded. "Everything." Victor glanced down at her hands, now empty. "No more weight?" "Not mine," she said. He gave a small smile. "And him?" She looked back across the street. Her voice didn't change. "He still thinks it's a game." Janet Mercer arrived at the bank 10 minutes early. She always did. The private banking wing smelled of leather and lavender polish, the kind of curated atmosphere designed to reassure the already powerful. Victor was already seated inside the glass-walled conference room, flipping through a packet with the slow, practiced patience of someone who didn't need to rush to win. He stood when she entered. No handshake. No pleasantries. Just two people who had already decided how this day would end. The banker entered a moment later carrying a slim black folder and an encrypted tablet. "Ms. Mercer," she said warmly, "everything is ready for your review." Janet slipped on her reading glasses, glanced at the document titles, then tapped the tablet once. "Proxy authority removal," she said, not as a question. "Yes," the banker confirmed. "This revokes Mr. Brian Mercer's access to the legacy account and any discretionary advisory privileges tied to the Quiet Futures Fund, permanently." Victor said nothing. He just watched. Janet tapped again, then signed. Done. No ceremony, no announcement, just a clean final click that echoed louder than it should have. Across the city, Brian's donation live stream stalled on its own opening slide. He sat in his studio office, lights perfectly placed, collar stiff, face powdered. He waited, listening for the countdown in his earpiece. It never came. His assistant peeked in. "The links aren't loading. Something's wrong with the integration between your campaign page and the foundation's donor portal." Brian clicked through the back end, but the dashboard had frozen. No access, no redirect, no numbers, just a message in soft gray. Account access restricted. Please contact administrator. He stared at it. Then again. Then harder. His phone buzzed on the desk. Melanie. He answered without greeting. Did you see what she posted? Melanie's voice came fast, tight. Janet Mercer removed her own son from the family trust. Betrayal by blood. That's the caption. It's everywhere now. What are you talking about? Brian snapped. Some burner account grabbed screenshots from the donor filings. Tagged you. Tagged me. I'm getting DMs asking if we've been disowned. Brian pulled up his phone. She wasn't exaggerating. The image was stark. A redacted PDF header showing proxy termination, B. A. Mercer, and the timestamp from that morning. Under it, a screenshot of Melanie's old Gala post with her arm around Brian. Caption: How fast the lights turn off when they were never yours. The comments were brutal. She handed you the stage and you still couldn't read the script. He fumbled a whole dynasty in a tux. You let her walk into the gala and walk out with the house keys. Melanie's voice returned, sharper now. Tell me you still have access. Tell me this is just optics. Brian didn't answer. He stood. The room suddenly felt too small, too lit. I need to make some calls, he said. Brian? He hung up. Back at the firm, Colleen Sharp stepped into a quiet corner office overlooking Logan Circle. A young lawyer in suspenders handed her a slim envelope with a satisfied nod. All filed, he said. Mercer Foundation holdings are fully transitioned. Any signatures moving forward require primary approval from Ms. Janet Mercer and the Quiet Futures Fund Board. Brian's name is not on any active instruments. Colleen glanced through the copy, then tucked it into her bag. If he contests? We have receipts, she smiled. You always do. At a cafe near the bank, Janet stirred her tea without looking up from the financial page on her tablet. Victor sipped his espresso across from her, relaxed. No questions, no commentary. Janet scrolled through the headline again. Mercer Legacy Fund officially repositions toward quiet leadership model. She looked up, amused. Quiet leadership. They really couldn't help themselves. Victor shrugged. They're not wrong. Janet leaned back, satisfied. The press release went out on a quiet Tuesday morning. No press conference, no ribbon cutting, just a single-page statement emailed directly to a curated list of local education outlets and longtime community partners. The Victor L. Mercer Literacy Fund will provide books, mentorship, and community programming for underserved youth in Washington, D.C., beginning with a pilot program in Ward 7 this fall. It was signed simply, The Quiet Futures Trust on behalf of Janet T. Mercer. No photos, no interviews, no mention of Brian. The story caught traction anyway, not for its noise, but for its precision. Victor Mercer's name still held weight. Real weight. Not just gala flashbulbs or curated quotes, the kind that made school principals click open and nonprofit directors text finally. That same morning, Rosa Delgado emailed Janet directly. No titles, no salary, but if you'll have me, I'd like to help organize your launch event. Janet replied with 2 words. Of course. On the other side of town, Melanie Crane stepped out of a Georgetown boutique with 3 glossy bags, sunglasses on, silk scarf perfectly tied. She smiled at the paparazzo she'd clearly tipped. Her caption was already written, Restocking Resilience. Your legacy looks forward. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that a donor compliance officer at the Mercer Foundation had flagged the charge hours ago. 4,780.32 filed under Community Engagement, Digital Development. And it wasn't the first. The internal expense log had grown suspiciously heavy with fashion tags, luxury dining, and executive wellness sessions. It didn't help that Brian had authorized each one with a careless e-signature. The foundation's board noticed. That afternoon, Brian Mercer walked into his weekly check-in thinking it would be routine. It wasn't. The board president, a former state senator, sat with her arms crossed and her notes printed in bold 14-point font. 3 other members joined via video, faces tight, questions sharper than usual. Where are the metrics on the donor campaign? What's the retention rate from your West Coast rollout? Do you know what your partner billed under educational programming? Brian blinked. We're streamlining receipts, he said. Everything's being reconciled. A board member muted themselves to laugh. You promised innovation, the senator said coolly. What we're seeing is an Instagram story with a credit card trail. Brian leaned forward, palms open. Let me handle this. I'll clean it up. You don't have the access anymore, she replied. We checked. Quiet Futures has control of the trust now. He sat back, throat tight. We believed in legacy, she added. We didn't think you'd try to buy it. The screen clicked off one by one. Brian remained seated, alone with the spreadsheet he hadn't opened in weeks. At a community center in Hillcrest Heights, Rosa walked the perimeter of a small event space with a clipboard in hand. Folding chairs were being arranged into clean rows. The smell of fresh paint and pine cleaner hung in the air. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. Janet stood near the back, watching it all unfold without stepping forward. You sure you don't want to speak? Rosa asked, glancing over her shoulder. I'll be there, Janet said. You are there, Rosa replied, whether you say a word or not. Janet said nothing, just nodded. Meanwhile, the article dropped. Mercer Foundation under review for misuse of donor fund sources. Say internal controls were casually ignored for months. The lead image wasn't Brian, it was Melanie. Shopping bags, sunglasses, champagne. The caption underneath read, Where philanthropy meets personal branding. The Mercer board didn't issue a comment, because Janet didn't allow one. The private law offices on Massachusetts Avenue didn't advertise. No sign, no directory listing, just a discreet brass plaque beside a mahogany door, polished so finely it blurred reflections. Janet Mercer entered alone. She wore navy again, sleek, unfussy. Her scarf was black silk. Her heels were low. She moved like someone used to making decisions on floors where others whispered. Colleen Sharp was already seated in the conference room, one hand resting on a slim legal folder, the other wrapped around a latte from a place that didn't print logos on cups. The attorney, an older woman with a federal clerk's stare and a wedding ring worn upside down, stood as Janet entered. She didn't waste time with small talk. We're ready when you are, Ms. Mercer. Janet nodded once and sat. On the table, a new will, a trust amendment, and a sealed envelope marked final, to be opened upon my death. Colleen flipped through the papers like a metronome. The Quiet Futures Fund is now the sole primary beneficiary. The Victor L. Mercer Literacy Initiative remains protected. Your personal estate, aside from heirlooms and archives, transfers directly into the general endowment. And Brian? Janet asked, without looking up. Removed, Colleen said. Fully. No fallback clause, no discretionary override. He receives nothing unless granted posthumous board approval. Janet picked up the pen. Signed once, twice, sealed the envelope herself. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to feel the weight of it. Colleen pressed her notary stamp onto the bottom corner of each page. Clean, final, binding. Do you want him notified? She asked. Janet shook her head. Let him find out like everything else. Too late, and online. Across town, in a co-working space Brian had once pitched as where the next generation of givers meets grit, his phone buzzed with another headline. Mercer Patriarch's name now fully controlled by Quiet Futures Fund. Exclusive. Janet Mercer rewrites family legacy. Literally. He dropped the phone face down. Melanie was seated across from him, flipping through a printout of her latest influencer stats. "These numbers are junk," she muttered. "What's happening to our reach?" Brian didn't answer. He was staring at the framed photo on the back shelf, one taken at his first gala. Victor standing beside him, Janet in the background. He'd cropped her out when he posted it. Now she was everywhere, every story, every whisper. And he was the blur. Back in the law office, Janet opened her bag and removed a slim portfolio wrapped in linen ribbon. She handed it to Colleen. "The shares, for Rosa." Colleen blinked. "You're serious?" "She's not just helping," Janet said. "She's building." Inside, stock certificates for a mid-sized tech firm Janet had backed 15 years ago. Quietly, when no one believed in it. The valuation had quadrupled. "These go into her name, not her charity," Janet added. "Let her decide what to do with them." Colleen closed the folder gently. "You've thought of everything." Janet gave a faint smile. "No, but I've thought of enough." Meanwhile, in a condo Melanie didn't own, still listed under a Mercer Foundation shell account, a knock sounded at the door. She opened it in a robe and sunglasses. A man in a gray suit handed her a clipboard and a large white envelope. "Melanie Crane?" he asked. "Yes?" "You're being served." She blinked. "Excuse me?" He turned and walked off before she could process it. Inside the envelope, audit paperwork, sealed request for deposition, line items from donor spending logs, a signature mismatch form flagged by the board. At the bottom, in crisp legal type, cause for inquiry, suspected personal use of restricted funds. She dropped the envelope, then picked it back up, then turned off her phone. Later that evening, Colleen stepped into Janet's garden unannounced. The gate creaked open with old familiarity. Janet was trimming the dogwood, pruning shears in hand. She didn't turn. "You're late," she said. Colleen smiled. "You're never surprised." "You're always predictable." Colleen stepped closer. "It's done, all of it. We burned the blueprint he thought he was still following." Janet snipped another branch, let it fall gently into the basket. "Good," she said. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. Because some inheritances aren't taken away. They're simply never given. The freeze hit without a headline. No press leak. No scandalous reveal. Just a string of failed logins, bounced transfers, and red warning bars where green ones used to be. Brian Mercer sat in his office, refreshing the same screen over and over. Account locked. Under financial review, access temporarily restricted pending compliance inquiry. He didn't scream. He didn't move. The number of zeros behind that account had once been his armor, his shield against scrutiny, memory, failure. Now it was just a locked door with his name still etched above it. Useless. Calls went unanswered. Emails bounced back. The board, newly restructured, had voted within 48 hours to suspend all discretionary expenditures linked to his leadership tenure. He wasn't removed, not yet. But the temperature had dropped to a chill even he could feel. By Thursday, the donor portal flagged 34 withdrawals. Not money, names, foundations, families, legacy trusts, all distancing, all cautious, not dramatic, just gone. Melanie's socials went dark the same day. No announcement, no apology. Just vanishing. Her last post, a moody black and white shot captioned, "Learning when to walk away is a kind of wealth," was deleted by mid-morning. A private story later surfaced on a burner account, tagged from Tulum, but it was gone before anyone could screenshot it. Brian scrolled through her feed anyway. Every blank tile was another breath knocked out of him. The Mercer name no longer trended. It echoed. In a sun-warmed kitchen across the city, Janet Mercer stood at the counter dusting flour across the edge of a perfectly folded pie crust. Victor leaned against the doorframe, hands tucked in his pockets, watching like a man who'd just survived a storm without ever raising his voice. "You're early," Janet said. "You're baking," he replied. "Which means something's gone right." She didn't look up. "It's Apple. For Rosa's team." Victor smiled. "I'm sure they'll say it's the best thing you've ever made." "It's not about the pie," Janet said softly. He knew that. She boxed it carefully, sliding it into a recycled brown paper bag, then washed her hands in silence. That afternoon, Rosa's community center bustled with final prep. Volunteers hung vinyl banners that read, "Victor L. Mercer Literacy Fund," official launch, and two teenagers folded pamphlets in matching sweatshirts that said, "Read louder." No podium, no fanfare. Just 80 chairs, 6 bookshelves, and a room that smelled like new carpet and possibility. At the back of the room, Colleen unrolled a floor mat and taped down its edges. Her phone buzzed mid-bend. From Victor. "Final transfers are confirmed. Quiet Futures now holds 100% asset control. Zero liabilities. All channels clean." She exhaled once, calmly, and tucked the phone away. Everything was ready. The next morning, the Washington Chronicle ran it front and center. "The foundation that didn't ask permission. Janet Mercer launches quiet initiative with loud results." Page A1, full spread, 2 columns, no photo of Janet. Just the new literacy center, rows of donated books, and a quote from Rosa. "Sometimes the best legacies are built by women who let everyone else keep talking." Brian saw it in a coffee shop. He wasn't recognized. He wasn't approached. The barista spelled his name Brian on the cup. He didn't correct her. By Friday, his inbox was a war zone of flagged threads. Inquiries, interviews, old allies asking for a minute. No one said it, but all of them implied the same thing. You've lost the room. The real room. Not the one with cameras or canapé trays. The one where decisions are made and names are remembered or deleted. He closed the laptop. His hands shook. For the first time in weeks, he understood what it meant to not be part of the next sentence. That night, Janet stood at the back of the community center with Rosa, watching the final wave of students file in for the weekend reading program. "Some of these kids," Rosa said, "they've never had their name on a book plate." Janet nodded. "Then let's change that." She turned toward the window. Outside, the city moved on. No cameras, no applause. Just a room full of futures speaking for themselves. The office smelled like fresh paint and unstained wood. New beginnings masked in primer and polish. Janet Mercer stood in the entryway, eyes slowly adjusting to the light streaming through tall glass windows. She'd been in 1,000 offices more expensive than this. More impressive, but none that looked more like hers. Not because her name was on the door now, but because no one had to ask whose choices shaped the foundation beneath it. Behind her, a quiet hum of activity, boxes being unpacked, cables being routed, chairs shifted an inch left or right until they aligned just so. Rosa directed the flow like a conductor without baton or ego, clipboard in one hand, measuring tape in the other. Janet moved through the space slowly, taking it in. The clean lines, the purposeful colors, the absence of vanity. No portraits, no plaques, no spotlight for the sake of legacy. Until now. At the far end of the main hallway, Colleen Sharp stood holding a tri-folded press release in one hand and a steaming mug of Earl Grey in the other. She handed the paper over. "It's going out in the next hour," she said. "Front page, no embargo. By tomorrow, everyone will know." Janet opened the release. It was short, sparse, tactful. Janet T. Mercer named founding architect of Quiet Futures Initiative. After more than a decade of anonymous stewardship, the fund's origin has been formally acknowledged. True power, she said, was never about volume. It was about value. That was all. No interviews, no podcast tours, no book deal whispers. Just one clean acknowledgement that the work spoke first, and she'd been the voice behind it. Janet folded the paper once, handed it back, and said nothing. Colleen grinned. "I'll tell the printer." Across the room, Rosa called out gently, "Janet, you'll want to see this." They walked together to the newly mounted central wall, still faintly smelling of wood stain and adhesive. There, placed with exacting care, was a bronze plaque. No gold, no fanfare, just truth, rendered in silence, in honor of Janet Hale, for building what others only inherited. Janet's eyes didn't water, but her voice did catch, just for a second. "She would have hated this," Janet said. "Probably," Rosa replied, "but she'd be proud." Behind them, Victor leaned quietly against the back wall, sipping coffee from a thermos no one else would ever see him carry. He didn't move closer, didn't interrupt. He just smiled. He knew the cost of this ending, and the value of it, because it hadn't come with applause, it had come with consequence. Elsewhere in the city, Brian Mercer sat alone in a sunless office, smaller now, rented. The kind of space where windows faced brick walls and ambition came with coffee from paper cups. His inbox remained unread. His calendar, blank. No speaking engagements. No interviews. No invitations to return to the stage. His name was still listed on a few outdated donor directories, and a LinkedIn post still congratulated him on continued philanthropic leadership, but none of it mattered. He scrolled through his contacts, stared at her name, Mother. He hovered, and didn't call. He never would, because power once misunderstood was never his to hold. Just borrowed, just inherited, and inheritance, he'd learned, can be revoked without warning or remorse. Back at the foundation, Rosa placed a final stack of books on the front reception shelf. The Fire Next Time, Educated, Between the World and Me, Beloved, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Above them, etched into the wall in small serif type, We Teach Not What to Think, but How. V.L. Mercer. Janet read it once, then stepped back toward the exit. Her work here wasn't done, but the proving was over. Outside, the late afternoon sun angled sharp across the pavement. Another season shifting. Another silence breaking, not with noise, but with meaning. Colleen walked with her to the front door. "He ever reach out?" she asked. Janet slipped on her gloves. "Not once." Colleen nodded. "Good." Janet paused, one hand resting on the doorframe. Her voice was quiet, measured. "He opened his mouth," she said. "I opened my vault," and closed his chapter for good.